Over 50% of the land distributed to the previously disadvantaged has failed to render tangible benefits. A recent study of KZN suggests that it's only long-term cooperative arrangements in the land distribution process that can see tangible benefits realized by those to whom the land is transferred. To get more on this, I'm joined in studio by Professor Nhlanhla Mbatha. He's Finance and Economics Area Head at the Unisa Graduate School of Business Leadership. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, since 1994, how much land has been distributed and what has been the success rate in terms of making that land productive?
So our target initially was 30% by 2014. We fell way short of that, sort of around about 10%. Hence, so the process for land redistribution, which is different from land restitution, which all fall under land reform. So our research really has looked on the first part, the redistribution process, which is mainly for business. So that's where we've fallen short. And so in 2005, there was the Land Summit to try and speed up the rate. But 2014 came and we were still struggling with the mud throwing between commercial farmers and government around prices. So,
Now, you've been concentrating your study around KZN, and in that instance we see that only 3.8% of the land that was originally supposed to be distributed to KZN has actually been distributed. And you've also found that the benefits that accrue to the people that it's been transferred to have not been that great. Can you just explain to us why that's happened in the case of KZN?
Well, it's happened across the country. So on average, only 50% of the land farms, commercial farms that have been redistributed under the program have actually remained productive under the transfer on average nationally. So there are two problems essentially. One is around the valuation process of the land. And that is what has brought the conflicts amongst the commercial sector and government. In our findings, initially, we found that the valuation process was so red-taped, the transaction costs were very high. It would take on average around 3 years for government to actually evaluate the land and give an offer to the farmers. And by that time, the prices had gone up, and then there would be the conflict. So that's the main part of the reason why the process of transfer initially was slow. And those were the findings that we kept on pushing out to the various stakeholders. A response to that particular point was the enactment of the Property Valuation Act last year, number 17, and I'll come back to that. But on the issue that you raised on why the land has not been productive, even for the small percentages of the land that had been transferred, where around what we found in the study was that in cases where there were arrangements, contractual arrangements between the three stakeholders, incoming farmers, government, and the commercial farmers, for the outgoing farmers to remain on the land, transfer skills, introduce the new farmers into business networks. That's where we found lots of success in terms of post-transfer productivity rates, to an extent that on average 12%, those farms were doing better by 12%. And so our later proposal was then to say, well, if this appears to be a model that works, why don't we expand it to other sectors? So I said that government had responded to the evaluation processes, which is the first area of problems in terms of the rates of transfers, by coming up with a new act. But, the Act has got 5 principles, and some of them, they're all politically sensible, but in terms of whether or not they would be addressing the valuation processes in speeding them up, I have my reservations. I have not seen yet an adoption of some of the proposals that we've been making, even within the HSRC, which is government's main policy mouthpiece, I would say. in terms of adopting a model where we've got cooperative agreements between outgoing farmers, incoming farmers for skills transfer and business benefits that I had mentioned.
If I may interject, Professor, it does sound like a very good idea to have that skills transfer and having your previous commercial farmer staying on and assisting. But what do you do in situations, you know, these are commercial transactions. What do you do in situations where somebody wants to sell their farm and they want to leave the country? You know, they're not obliged to stick around. So in those types of scenarios, what do you do? How do you fill the skills transfer gap?
My research is not particularly on that question, but it's a valid question, and it's not one of the case studies that we've looked at. So in cases, it appears that the cases where there is a willingness for the outgoing farmers to stay on the land, it's big companies. In our case, sugarcane farms in KZN, Hewlett's, you know, those big guys. So it's not just one individual that wants to pack the bags and go. It's an actual company that wants to be involved in the empowerment of communities where they operate. And so it's those types of case studies that we've looked at, those types of business structures that we want the model to be adapted into other provinces and into different sectors to test them out and see whether or not we'd get the same positive results in terms of not having this 50% of land that's lying idle.
And just more broadly, Professor, when you, based on the studies that you've looked at and so on and so forth, agribusiness has been touted as the solution for some of our employment and food security concerns. Do you think if we get everything, our ducks in a row, we can actually conquer these issues?
Well, firstly, agriculture is very important in South Africa for employment. Why? Because it's quite labor intensive. Besides the fact that it's always been on the agenda of each and every cabinet since Thabo Mbeki's government. And the reason is that what South Africa has experienced is a jobless growth. I don't know if you remember, 10 years ago, we've been experienced lots of growth before the 2008 crash, but that growth was not yielding into employment. And economists have always been arguing that it's because most of the growth is happening in tertiary sectors and excluding primary sectors like agriculture, where there's lots of labor required into absorbing the labor force into the labor market. So yes, definitely it is important that we get the agricultural sector right, especially in a country like South Africa where we are mainly low skilled. Right? It takes 20 years to train people into tertiary technical skills, so we can't just write off a generation and say, well, you can't get employed because we are focused on a different type of sector. That's not, so it's key.
All right, thank you very much, Professor. We're going to have to leave it there.
Thank you.
That was Professor Nhlanhla Mbatha. He's from Unisa Graduate School of Business Leadership. Well, that's all from us here at Business Review. We'll have more business for you next week. Do take care until then.